It wasn't a statistical anomaly. It wasn't a reaction to a single supply chain shock. It wasn't even a standard business cycle correction. It was the synchronized closing of the monetary gates. Look at the timing. The Federal Reserve tightens. The European Central Bank follows. The Bank of England mirrors the move. Even the Bank of Japan, long the outlier, begins to shift its stance. They call it a fight against inflation. They call it normalization, but the arithmetic suggests a different motive. When every major central bank moves in lockstep, it is not a coincidence, it is a defensive formation. The global financial system is a singular, interconnected web of debt. When the collateral values shake in New York, they tremble in London and Tokyo. We are witnessing a rare historical alignment. This is what happens when the debt supercycle reaches its mathematical limit. The incentive is to manage the inevitable devaluation together. If one nation devalues alone, its currency collapses. If all nations devalue together, exchange rates remain relatively stable. It creates the illusion of stability, while the purchasing power of the citizenry quietly evaporates. The pattern is unmistakable. The arithmetic is merciless. We are not seeing a recovery. We are seeing the coordinated management of a structural decline. The central banks are not driving the car anymore. They are merely trying to keep it on the road. As the brakes fail, to understand where this leads, we must look backward. We must examine the moments in history when the managers of money tried to defy the laws of economics. We must look at the Roman crisis of the 3rd century. We must look at the Spanish price revolution. We must look at the great inflation of the 1970s. In every case, the authorities claimed they had the situation under control. In every case, the math won. Consider the Roman Empire during the crisis of the 3rd century, specifically the period following the death of Emperor Severus Alexander in 235 AD. This era provides the archetype for what happens when a centralized power attempts to coordinate a monetary debasement to service unpayable military and administrative debts. The Roman state did not have a central bank in the modern sense, but the imperial mints functioned with the same monopoly power over currency issuance. The fiscal situation was dire. The empire had ceased expanding, meaning the influx of plunder that had sustained the economy for centuries had stopped, yet the costs of maintaining the legions and the bureaucracy remained fixed and growing. The incentive for the imperial administration was clear. They could not raise taxes further without sparking rebellion, so they chose to alter the currency itself. Under the Severan dynasty and continuing through the barracks emperors, the silver content of the denarius was systematically reduced. This was not an accidental drift, it was a coordinated policy across all imperial mints. In the time of Augustus, the denarius was nearly pure silver. By the mid-3rd century, under the reign of Gallienus, the silver content had collapsed to less than 5%. The coins were essentially copper washed in a thin layer of silver that rubbed off in a soldier's hand. Historians estimate that prices for basic goods like wheat and olive oil skyrocketed by over 1,000% in many provinces. The human element of this tragedy is found in the surviving letters of soldiers stationed on the frontiers. They wrote home complaining that their pay, nominally increased by the emperors to ensure loyalty, could no longer buy their equipment or food. The state's attempt to solve a fiscal problem with a monetary trick resulted in the complete breakdown of trade networks, forcing the economy to revert to localized barter. Later, Emperor Diocletian would attempt to fix this with the Edict on Maximum Prices, a coordinated attempt to ban inflation by decree. It failed spectacularly, as goods simply disappeared from the markets entirely, leaving the cities to starve. Just like the Roman debasement, the Spanish Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries faced a similar crisis of coordination and consequences. The Spanish Habsburgs controlled the greatest empire the world had arguably ever seen, fueled by the rivers of silver flowing from the mines of Potosi in the Americas. However, the sheer volume of this new money created a phenomenon known to economic historians as the price revolution. The Spanish crown, led by Philip II, was engaged in continuous warfare across Europe, fighting the Ottomans, the Dutch, and the English simultaneously. The cost of these wars far exceeded even the massive revenues from the New World. The constraints were physical and mathematical. To pay the armies, the crown borrowed heavily from Genoese and German bankers, pledging future silver shipments as collateral. When the silver arrived, it flowed immediately out of Spain to pay creditors and soldiers abroad, spreading the inflation throughout the continent. This was a form of unintentional but synchronized monetary shock. The influx of silver devalued the currency not just in Madrid, but in Antwerp, Genoa, and London. The Spanish government defaulted on its debt obligations in 1575, 1596, 1607, 1707, 1647. Each default was a systemic shock that froze credit markets across Europe. Was the universal acceptance of Spanish silver, which bound the European economies together in a web of inflation. A laborer in Castile saw the price of grain rise fivefold between 1500 and 1600, while wages stagnated. The payoff for the crown was the ability to continue its wars for a few more years, but the result was the hollowing out of the Spanish domestic economy. The middle class was crushed between rising prices and heavy taxation, while the aristocracy whose wealth was in land remained insulated. The great banking dynasties of the time, such as the Fuggers, were eventually ruined by their exposure to Spanish sovereign debt. The empire had chosen to prioritize geopolitical ambition over sound money, and the resulting economic sclerosis doomed Spain to centuries of decline, just like the Spanish inflation. The global monetary system of the 1970s experienced a synchronized failure that mirrors our current predicament. The collapse of the Bretton Woods system in 1971 and the subsequent Great Inflation serves as the most direct parallel to today's central bank coordination. Following President Nixon's closure of the gold window, the major currencies of the world were unmoored from any physical anchor. For the first time in history, the entire globe was operating on a fiat standard simultaneously. The initial reaction from global central banks was a coordinated attempt to stimulate growth through loose monetary policy. In the United States, Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns, under pressure from the executive branch to reduce unemployment, kept interest rates artificially low despite rising price signals. The Bank of England and other European central banks followed similar loose policies, prioritizing short-term political stability over long-term currency value. The result was a synchronized explosion in inflation that ravaged the developed world. By the late 1970s, inflation in the United States hit double digits, while in the United Kingdom it soared above 20%. The Smithsonian Agreement of 1971, which was hailed as the greatest monetary agreement in the history of the world, attempted to set new fixed exchange rates without gold. It failed within months because the market recognized that the underlying policies were unsound. The human cost was visible in the labor strikes of the winter of discontent in Britain and the gas lines in America. Savers who held cash or government bonds were decimated, seeing the real value of their lifetime labor cut in half in less than a decade. The bond markets eventually revolted, forcing a painful correction under Paul Volcker. The central banks had moved together to support the system, but they only succeeded in coordinating the devaluation of their respective currencies against real assets. The pattern repeats in 7 distinct stages regardless of the technology or the century. Stage 1 is sound money, Stage 2 is the expansion, Stage 3 is deficit spending, Stage 4 is monetary expansion, Stage 5 is price inflation, Stage 6 is the reaction, Stage 7 is the reset. Just like the reaction phase of the 1970s, we are currently witnessing Stage 6 in real time. The major central banks of the world, the Fed, the ECB, the BOJ, are engaged in a delicate synchronized dance. They raised rates ostensibly to fight inflation, but current data suggest a different, more structural objective. They are attempting to manage the real value of global sovereign debt. The debt to GDP ratios in the G7 nations are at levels that historically necessitate a default or a devaluation, and open default is politically impossible. Therefore, the rational move is a coordinated period of negative real interest rates. Some economists argue that the recent tightening cycle proves the independence of central banks. However, this ignores the liquidity injections that occur quietly in the background. The net liquidity often remains loose even as rates rise. This is known as fiscal dominance. The simultaneous nature of these policies prevents a run on any single major currency. This masks the decline from the average observer. You do not see the dollar collapsing against the euro. You see both collapsing against housing, food, and gold. There are only 3 ways this mathematical imbalance resolves. The first outcome is controlled decline, financial repression. The second outcome is chaotic collapse, hyperinflation. The third outcome is reset and restructure new system. Subscribe to the channel, focus on education and resilience. Watch the data, not the speeches.